Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Earth Laws Month webinar today, the 20th of September. I'm really delighted to shortly introduce to you some of our guest speakers from the Ocean Rights and Kinship Network, and the wonderful James Tremlett is going to tell you all about the network before we then introduce our other speakers. But before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge country. For those not from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, or other places that were colonised, this might be a bit of an unusual tradition, but for us, it's very important that we acknowledge whose First Peoples country we live on. So I live, work, and play on the beautiful traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples here in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the elders, past and present, and the emerging young leaders and the emerging peoples working towards their own sovereignty and caring for country. I always like to acknowledge the remarkable civilizational culture that cared for country and cared for kin since time immemorial. And here in Australia, it's extremely important for those of us who are non-Indigenous to be recognising the ongoing impacts and legacy of the colonial project by the British Empire in our case, and the work that we do inside the Australian Earth Laws Alliance and our sister organisations Future Dreaming and the New Economy Network are deeply committed to working in solidarity with First Peoples and playing a humble contribution or a humble role in breaking down some of these old colonial ideas, not just about ourselves and each other, but about the living world, and in this case today, our beautiful oceans. So before I introduce our speakers, and if all goes well with my buttons, we all know I get tormented by button problems. There we go, hooray. I wanted to give a quick plug for the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, my beautiful organisation. The Australian Earth Laws Alliance works to create systems change by promoting the understanding and practical implementation of Earth-centred governance. We've got a really remarkable focus now, I think, across all of what we would call under the umbrella of Earth Laws. And you can see on our website here, the Earth Laws Centre looks at rights of nature, ecocide, ecological law, and first laws, which is a crossover with our work with our Indigenous partnership organisation, Future Dreaming, caring for country and first laws. We also want to give a plug for the fact that we auspiced the New Economy Network Australia and co-host many events with our economic friends on economics for the earth, including as part of Earth Laws Month. The first full week of September, we had some pretty important discussions about everything from human population and degrowth to post-extractivism and beyond. And I'm not going to bore you with a full-on commercial for Earth Laws Month, but we're only halfway through. If you've been part of our many events and you're feeling a bit like, oh my gosh, there's more. Yes, there is. It's very exciting. So we've got lots of terrific events coming up. Last week, we had some Indigenous-led discussions as well as regenerative, talking about ecocide, talking about many good things. So please do visit the webpage and have a little look and join with us in our celebration of humanity's relationship with the living world. That's enough from me and my ongoing commercial for Ayla. Today, I'm really delighted to introduce some friends and colleagues who we are part of this emerging Ocean Rights and Kinship Network. I will let each person introduce themselves fully. These days, folks wear so many hats, I think, and they're also accomplished. I could spend many, many minutes introducing them. But we're going to have folks join us in the following order. James Tremlett will be talking about the Ocean Rights and Kinship Network and some of his work. And then we're going to go to Rachel, and I'm sorry, Rachel, I've never said your last name before, Bustamante. That's a very Australian way of saying it. It might be much more glamorous. And Rachel is from the Earth Laws Centre, and she and Michelle Bender and others have been working on the ocean rights campaigns and work, which are very fascinating and very interesting. And then we may have Daniel, Prue, and Elise, and I might let them introduce themselves as they come up. It depends on the timing and how they'd like to organise themselves. So without further ado, I will take the spotlight off the rest of us and hand over to you, Mr. James Tremlett, my partner in crime in convening this emerging network. Over to you, James, and thank you.
Thanks very much for the introductions, Michelle, and kia ora tātou to everyone who's joining us here today. So as Michelle said, my name's James. I'm speaking to you here from a town called Porirua, just north of Wellington, on the lands of Ngāti Toa Rangatira in Aotearoa, New Zealand. and I've got the great honor really of being a co-convenor of this Ocean Rights and Kinship Network. And I thought we'd just start this webinar today by taking a few minutes to speak about this network itself, how it's come to be, because origins are important, I think, and then what its aims and intentions are, and to share some of our collective thinking about what ocean rights and kinship means as a concept, and then also in practice as that practice emerges. And I'll then hand over to our other speakers to share about their own work in more detail. So our Ocean Rights and Kinship Network really began with a workshop in 2018 that was convened by a good friend of many of us, the late Sue Tae. Sue unfortunately passed away several years ago, but the work that she started in the field of ocean rights and kinship really is continuing on in many forms around the Pacific and around the world. And so much credit to Sue for kicking this off in many ways. That initiative also received support from the University of Auckland and Conservation International, who Sue worked for. The purpose of that gathering really was to draw on emerging legal thought around the rights of nature and legal personhood, and to think about how these could be applied to the ocean, both within and across national jurisdictions. And Sue, unlike many of us, Sue used a phrase that she called ocean kinship rights to articulate this. And I was looking this morning through some old emails from Sue, which is funny that you can do that, but it's important. And I found this phrase where Sue wrote, "Among the people of Oceania, ocean kinship embodies the mana of the relationship between people and the ocean, and creates obligation and rights between the related entities. By developing this thinking into a legal grounding, ocean kinship rights across the planet can bring traditional Indigenous thinking together with modern legal rights of nature concepts at a scale befitting the ocean." And lots of us who are here on the call today may articulate things a bit differently to that, but I think the values that Sue brought to that conversation and the broad vision of recognizing the inherent rights, I suppose, of the ocean is something that we've really tried to continue on through this network. So from that same gathering, we created a statement of our collective thought on ocean rights and kinship. And I've got the whole thing in front of me and I won't read it all out. But I think that the key element of that is that we have a responsibility and an obligation to conserve, protect, and defend the rights of the ocean, the rights of past, present, and future generations of all beings that rely on the rights of the ocean. The ocean is not a property or a resource, nor solely here for human benefit. We do not own the ocean. She is an entity with rights including, but not limited to, the right to exist, thrive, and evolve, the right to integral health, the right to be free of pollution and a healthy, functioning climate system, the right to restoration and regeneration, and to continue her vital functions and cycles. We acknowledge our kinship with the ocean. We must shift from rights to the ocean towards responsibilities and obligations to the ocean. And that notion of obligations, perhaps we can come back to later in the webinar, because I think it's really interesting. So as a group, I think we've spent quite a bit of time thinking about how ocean rights and kinship operate at an international level across jurisdictions, in particular in the Pacific. Certainly some of us here in Aotearoa are starting to think more about how within our own national system of ocean governance and ocean policy, how ocean rights or ocean kinship as a foundational principle for making decisions could be folded into that existing governance regime. But as a group, we've talked quite a lot about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. UNCLOS doubtless being a highly flawed text, but Sue actually would always point out some of the language from the preamble, which says the legal order that UNCLOS is establishing will facilitate and promote the peaceful uses of the seas and oceans, the equitable and efficient utilization of their resources, the conservation of their living resources, and the study, protection, and preservation of the marine environment. So essentially, along with rights to explore and exploit, also come responsibilities to protect, conserve, and manage the ocean. And these responsibilities, these obligations, remain largely unimplemented. And it may be that recognition of the inherent rights of the ocean is one way to do this. So I do say rights with some skepticism in my voice, because we all know the limitations of that word in the English language. One Fijian friend recently pointed out to me that the concept of rights can also strip a natural entity of its agency, in the same way that the concept of human rights has sometimes been deployed in a paternalistic and demeaning way. And the opposite, I suppose, is true as well. Another good friend just the other week pointed out that there are plenty of people in our society whose human rights we theoretically recognize, but whom we repeatedly don't respect. And so legally recognizing rights is not necessarily a silver bullet or an answer in any particular way to these problems that are facing us, but they can potentially build a stronger foundation for decision making that respects the life of the ocean, I suppose. And the same is true of legal personhood. So while a useful tool in the right context, it too can obscure the true nature of a natural entity. So a river, of course, although it can be useful legally to recognize a river as a person, a river, of course, is not a person, it's a river, it's itself. And an ocean is not a person either. And a good Hawaiian friend just the other day remarked that perhaps it's more useful to talk about recognizing oceanhood rather than personhood. So the rights of an ocean just to be an ocean, healthy and thriving, and to utilize that as a legal principle for the basis of decision making. And as I mentioned before, many others would think about obligation. So the obligations of a people group to the ocean and of the ocean to those people. What would laws of mutual obligation look like with regard to the ocean? That's something that I am not sure about. I know that Michelle has done some work on this in an Australian context, but certainly that's something I would like to discuss further within this network. So for the network as a whole, what's its purpose? What's its intention? We're here basically to connect people who work with ocean rights and kinship as a conceptual framework or as a practical framework, to share ideas with each other and to collaborate on practical initiatives. We're here to normalize the idea of kinship or oceanhood as a basis for decision making, especially among policymakers or people who make decisions in that space, so that it's not a radical or unheard of idea, so that it can be something that seems quite sensible or even intuitive. And finally, and probably most importantly, to learn from people and from groups who know and understand all these things through their own traditional practices, and to provide a medium for those lessons to spread into people who are making these decisions as part of their own profession. So that's me. I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview of the Ocean Rights Network and what we're intending to do as a group. And please feel free to flick through any questions into the chat or into the group afterwards. I think there may be an invitation going out to people who've attended this webinar who want to get more involved. I'm not sure, Michelle, if we can do that, if we have an email list.
Sorry, I was talking with the mute on. Yes, absolutely. I'll pop in some details sort of shortly, and then later we can definitely collect people's names if you're interested in joining. I think at the moment we've been meeting about every 6 weeks, really just sharing updates on interesting work and projects. And we started exploring the idea of collating and creating, where they haven't been created, very short stories from folks around, particularly the Pacific, because that's where most of us are, but anywhere really, creating a bit of a mini library about people's stories about their connection to the oceans and the waterways. And I think Elise may talk a bit more about that when she joins us later in our webinar.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, James. That was a lovely introduction. And now I will invite Rachel from the Earth Laws Centre, who I understand it's 9 o'clock at night yesterday. So Rachel, today is looking lovely, and I hope that your yesterday is good too. Please share with us some of the really amazing work that you guys have been doing, looking at the rights of oceans.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm Rachel Bustamante, Conservation Science and Policy Analyst at Earth Law Center. I'm calling in from the East Coast of the United States and the stolen and indigenous lands of the Lumbee tribe, among others, on the North Carolina coast. And I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Let me know if not. Okay, great.
All good.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and represent Earth Law Center. Michelle is traveling at the moment, Michelle Bender, so I'm happy to be here on her behalf. I'd like to relay some updates and information about our work today and the new initiatives that I've been starting to get more involved on, but I'm still new, so I'll try to answer questions as best I can. But I'll really enjoy hearing everyone else's work and stories to see how we can best collaborate more and support each other even more. And I'll start, there we go, okay. So I think to start, I would say, Earth Law Center began delving into rights of nature and its application to ocean law and policy in 2017 when we began the Ocean Rights Program. And this began with a call to action to the United Nations and a framework that was exploring legal rights for marine protected areas. And as James alluded to, and as many I'm sure remember, we started to look into this Convention on the Rights of the Pacific Ocean and collective statement with many here led by Victor David, Conservation International, and produced this collective thinking on ocean kinship at the meeting in New Zealand in 2018. And here is when I really think we started to adapt our work and to learn and listen from everyone within this network and more broadly about the appropriate ways folks see and engage with law. So we have considered our ocean rights programs and initiatives as how we can bring and centralize the voice of the ocean and marginalized groups into decision making, especially in the Western sense, where there is still certainly a lot of work to do. So since New Zealand, we've continued to develop our campaigns and partnerships, including consulting with Tetiaroa and advisors across the Pacific on an ocean guardianship initiative, which has really been to look at what ocean rights means from a non-Western context. So through this, we have learned and recognized that different pathways exist to transform our relationship with nature, with the ocean, that do not explicitly involve rights, just as James alluded to, but the underlying ethics, values, and principles of a responsibility-based framework. So we adopt a broader reinterpretation of ocean rights, including all that we have learned from Pacific advocates, experts, and representatives, especially acknowledging the overwhelming experience of exclusion of Pacific voices in international law and frameworks, especially considering the ocean. So we're always seeking to learn, to listen, and understand best practices to support partners and better ways and more holistic ways to engage with law. And I just added one recent success and example of our work is with partner, the Leatherback Project. We introduced a national rights of nature law in Panama, which was approved this year, including also an amendment to recognize the rights of sea turtles through a secondary legislation that we're hoping will be signed by the end of the year. So towards a universal declaration of ocean rights. In partnership with the Ocean Race and now many others, we launched this initiative officially in March of this year, but through the Ocean Race summits and side consultations, we've been discussing this idea for about 2 years prior. In 2019, we were a part of an Ocean Race summit at The Hague alongside others, including Dan Hikaroa, where the discussion began taking more form. So as I mentioned, seeking to learn and amplify diverse understandings and the plurality of ways of knowing and relating to the ocean, This was really a catalyst in initiating the process of a universal declaration of ocean rights. And as a whole, it's an initiative, it's a proposed call to action to gather the global community together to develop a comprehensive and implementable global framework to protect the ocean, with the objective being that the United Nations General Assembly begins the process to develop this global declaration, ultimate goal adopting by 2030. And we understand that's, you know, a long way out, and we wish it was, you know, it could be a lot sooner, but we're understanding the lengthy process of the United Nations, certainly. So our pathway so far is to achieve this vision is for sponsoring countries to present these aspirations and this ask to the UNGA in September 2023. And our ask is that they begin a process to explore development of a declaration or something similar and recognize draft undermining principles of ocean rights. So instead of presenting a draft declaration or, you know, just a fully presented document, we're presenting our vision, the idea and principles and our understandings of the relationship humankind has with the ocean and how we may respect that plurality of worldviews with the ocean, providing, we hope, a blueprint for this ask for the UNGA to take this forward. And we learned from previous processes with Bolivia and the Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth that presenting a fully developed draft was not as successful. And we believe it needs to be more grounded in broad stakeholder participation in order to build that support. So as you can see from our time frame, we have innovation workshops, which are our core meetings, and we have a lot of steps along the way. Partially, one of those steps is to build momentum from all of the public. So we launched an online petition called One Blue Voice, and then we're gathering stakeholders through a series of workshops and meetings, which we're calling these innovation workshops, to go along with the ocean race and their conservation summits. So here we have and will continue to ask what everyone thinks of this, what they see as needs and challenges, what pathways or other initiatives we need to be aware of. There is a growing government support for the UDOR, and we seek certainly to engage states more, the public and NGOs and such, and are open and adaptive to changes or feedback to best facilitate a really consultative and inclusive approach before September 2023. The Ocean Race is supporting to carry this project, while Earth Law Center is providing more of that nonprofit arm and perspective. But we understand it is so essential that this process and this advocacy for the ocean not be led by the global north or predominantly Western perspectives. And this was actually a point that was discussed very heavily at our first innovation workshop. And we're still looking at how we can ensure this becomes reality, which perhaps we might have time to discuss this further today. I'm very open to ideas. The strategy is still very adaptive. We're exploring how to ensure better consultation, grounding with everyone that practices already a supportive relationship with the ocean. So we certainly see methods to facilitate that even better in the future, such as possibly an Ocean Rights Alliance. And really from our learning through Michelle's consulting and conversations and experiences with Mia Taro. But that's where we're at right now. That's our updates. We're adaptive, flexible, really open to ideas and feedback. I'm happy to take any questions in the chat or later on, and I'll try my best to answer them. Or since I'm newer to this project, I'm happy also to relate any comments or questions back to the core group and circle back with answers. But I sincerely thank you for this opportunity and really appreciate your participation. We're really excited about this initiative and seeing how we can best protect the ocean and amplify voices around the world for ocean care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really lovely. Nice to get an overview And I know that your group has been working very hard for many years, initiating some of these ideas. There's a question there from James for you. So I'm collecting the questions, folks. So if anyone else has notes or questions or quotes, notes or questions, please pop them in the chat. Okay, so and for anyone who's joined us a little later than the start off, we have 3 more wonderful speakers, and I'll introduce Daniel Hikuroa, and then we're going to have Prue Taylor and Elise Huffer, and then we'll have some questions and answers. And we will be wrapping up at about 12:25 today, Queensland time. I hope that that's okay. And now I'd love to invite Daniel to join us. So lovely to see that he could make the call today. Hello, Dan. How are you?
Yeah, kia ora, Michelle. What's it, koutou katoa? I'm good, thanks.
Over to you, Dan, to give us an update about the work you've been doing and the love you have for the oceans. Hooray!
Yeah, kia ora. And I appreciate, I apologise for my lateness, actually. We had an unscheduled MRI. I don't think any MRIs are kind of planned for a schedule, but daughter injured knee, but we're here now. We're talking oceans. It was really nice to get James's perspective on some of the ideas that are flowing around, and really, really wonderful to see an update on the work that yourself and Michelle are doing, and others, Rachel. I might just have a free flow on some of the ideas that are kind of flowing around in Aotearoa, New Zealand at the moment. And I'll actually start it with an event where I met James actually a few years back, the Wainanui Symposium that we held in Turanganui Kiwa in Gisborne in New Zealand. And that was notable for a few reasons. One of them being that we had a whole lot of the Polynesian navigators had coalesced upon New Zealand at that time, marking a commemoration of other people finding New Zealand, sometime using different methods. And it was a coming together of ideas and hopes and aspirations for the future. And at that time, the navigators expressed a strong concern that they were seeing that the health of the ocean was being impacted. They could see it, they could sense it, they could feel it in the work they did. And at the symposium, it was an opportunity to get together, share ideas, share some thinking around what we might actually want to do. We've been kind of hearing whispers of this for a little while, but to hear it really blatantly, clearly from the navigators was really powerful. And we were really lucky to have, as one of the speakers at the symposium, Professor Jacinta Ruru. Now, those of you who aren't keeping quite abreast of legal machinations in Aotearoa, New Zealand, may not actually recognise that name, but I'm sure many of you on the call, if not all of you, will recognise that a few years back we gave legal personality, legal voice to and our first one was actually to a national forest. It would have been a national park, and the waters and the forest and the lands and the organisms therein. That was our first one. And then the second one was, of course, the Whanganui River in our Te Awa Tupua Act, and that gained a lot of international recognition. Now, the reason Jacinta's name is important in that context is her PhD thesis effectively proved the idea that we could do this. It will be consistent with the law system we have in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it would be consistent with the Māori worldviews and knowledge systems. And so it was important to hear from her, and she spoke about those ideas and how they might play out a little in the ocean space. And ultimately, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, and James, you can kind of maybe chime in a little bit, maybe on the chat or in person. But she said that the idea itself, it was worthy of being pursued, noting that the large barrier to be overcome would be the difference between how land is governed and thought of and how oceans are governed and thought of. And that's kind of, that will chime in a little bit where some preliminary research that myself and others have explored around that idea, and it was on this notion of Mare Nullius. And going back to the question that I think Michelle asked, and I'll answer that question now. Although never explicitly stated, as best we can tell, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is underpinned by this concept of mare nullius, which is or mare liberum, as others call it, which is the legal doctrine that effectively, which is the maritime equivalent of terra nullius. And so basically saying, okay, the ocean is without people, or more correctly, the ocean is without civilized people, which is, I think, the underpinning of that. And we're of the opinion that that's not actually true at all. There is a vast knowledge of knowing the ocean. There's a vast knowledge of connecting with it, of knowing it. It's been described as the great marae of Polynesian peoples, both here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then most recently, Edward Fritsch described the Pacific Ocean as the great marae of Polynesian peoples. We're being very careful, though, that we don't want to superimpose what we believe on top of anyone else's beliefs, but we're saying that that's a common belief for many of us. And that offers an alternative view to the ocean. Instead of something that divides us, it's the thing that connects us, and it's known, and it's viewed, and this is where the contribution of the navigators comes in. It's viewed as an ancestor or as an ancestral entity. And for the navigators, and I need to be very clear that I don't want to speak on their behalf, but they shared some of their visions. I have been sharing some of their visions over the years, and then most recently at a Blue Climate Summit event held in Tahiti in May earlier this year, where they came out and they said, you know, for the navigators, and this is the kind of all the Polynesian navigators, they view the ocean as a female energy, as a female entity. They have a name for it. That's not for me to share. But they also shared at that summit that they felt that the ocean was screaming out for help, and that they wanted to start doing things, and that they once again asked those in attendance at the summit to come in and support the work that we need to do around addressing these pleas for help from the ocean. And so the idea of legal personhood, of legal personality, of oceanhood, I like that. I'm really aligning really strongly with that, James. What was a topic that was discussed and debated, and overall there was universal support for that approach moving forward, notwithstanding that there would be challenges. And I think one of them, this is going right back to the question around whether the UN Conventional Law of the Sea could be used to negotiate protection of oceans instead of just viewing oceans as a resource. The answer is yes, but it was designed to see the world that way. So it would be a very difficult mechanism to do that, and maybe not the right one, hence the discussion we're having today. But I think that's also important. We need to point out what the challenging aspects are of these existing things like the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We need to point out how they are challenging, as well as coming up with different ways that we might express our relationship with the oceans. Moving into kind of a little bit more local, but then kind of jumping out to the global at that point, ideas of restoring the vitality to the oceans, and in Māoridom we call that the mauri, the life supporting capacity of the oceans, and the right of the ocean just to be an ocean and to be healthy, is an idea that's very strongly being explored, debated, and right through from the community, what we'd call flax roots level in Aotearoa, New Zealand, right up to, you know, we're asking our Minister for Oceans, you know, how can he ensure the mauri of the ocean around Aotearoa, New Zealand, be kept in a vital state. And then we're also really looking to build up an idea that says, although we might have a legal right to do things within these kind of EEZ spaces and all those lines on maps, the things which we deem to manage in that space have no notion of those lines. And so often we'll hear communities say, well, no one tells the whales they've crossed from protected waters to international waters. No one tells the tuna that they've passed from these places. And so although that's you know, the UNCLOS kind of defines what ours and therefore what's not. And I use those words kind of a little bit tongue in cheek. We also think there's a responsibility to start thinking about what it might look like out in the oceans. What might the ocean be calling upon us to do? And how can we help? And so it's been really amazing to hear that and pick up on the work that yourself and others are doing, Rachel, and I look forward to hearing what others have got to contribute on this call. And maybe my final point will be that this is a very timely meeting, Michelle, because on Thursday I'm going to be giving a presentation to Te Ohu Kaimoana, which is a group that was established as an advocate for Māori voices when New Zealand decided that it would create a quota management system and divvy up all the fish. And Te Ohu Kaimoana was established because Māori rights were extinguished at that point. And while that's kind of a different level discussion, I was challenged by the current CEO to dare to dream a little and paint of a future where we might be, you know, expressing things a little bit differently. And knowing that this was happening today and that I might be able to say to folks, hey, would it be okay if I mentioned that you're doing this kind of work in that dare to dream space, before then bringing it right back into but how do we make that happen? So kia ora mai tātou.
Thank you so much, Dan. Some very thoughtful comments and insights there. I'm now very delighted to introduce Prue Taylor. And Prue is a very well-respected, I was going to say human being. You can tell I haven't had enough coffee today. And looks after the Environmental Law Centre in New Zealand, I think connected to the Auckland University. So I will spotlight you, Prue, and turn the spotlight off Daniel. So Daniel, you can relax now and drink your cup of tea. And Prue, really lovely for you to join us. We know that you're all very busy people. So love to hear from you about your current work and updates from your connection with the ocean.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Michelle and James, for organising this event, and thank you to everybody who's here and showing their active interest and commitment to the ocean. I'm a legal academic at the University of Auckland and the Deputy Director of the New Zealand Centre for Environmental Law. And a lot of my work is around the Earth system, in a general sense, but also I focus very much on climate, the climate system, and the oceans and the nexus between them. So what I'd like to do is just give you a sort of quick overview of some of the things that we've already touched on, but from a more specifically legal perspective. But the introduction that James has given us, the more specific focus of Rachel, and then again the broader comments from Dan are all a context within which my comments now kind of fit. So what I want to do is speak a little bit about the intersect between ocean kinship and the law. And as we know, very often when we're, as you know, lawyers like me, when we're talking about the law, unless we make a sort of specific mention of speaking of Indigenous legal systems, essentially we're talking about Eurocentric legal systems. And the Eurocentric legal systems, whether we're talking about national level legal systems or international legal systems, does very little to protect the ocean and very little to sustain the life that depends on the ocean itself. So Dan spoke sort of very well about UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, and we can say that this particular component of our legal system is very human-centered. It focuses very much on resource exploitation. It's very rights-based and it's very state-centric. On top of that, we have transposed environmental law. Environmental law itself is really ineffective, largely ineffective to protect the ocean and life that depends on the ocean. Environmental law is largely about doing a bit less bad, a bit less harm. It's not about proactively doing good for the ocean. Its motivation is largely to continue resource exploitation, and all up it kind of legitimizes death by 1,000 cuts. So environmental law writ large in a Eurocentric context slows down the rate of harm. It's better than nothing, but overall it doesn't change anything particularly, and it certainly doesn't affirm the life of the ocean. However, that's sort of a brief synopsis of what's wrong. What I've seen over the last 30 years of being an international environmental lawyer is something really, really encouraging, and it is absolutely growing recognition that there's an urgent need for all this to change and to create a new governance and legal order that is exponentially different. That's not tweaking or renovating the law, but creating a governance and legal order that is exponentially different. And by that, what I mean is one that's built on an understanding of the most profound relationships, and relationships is absolutely critical. And this is a profound relationship that human beings in all life share. And that relationship is around the ocean as the creator and the sustainer of all life. And it's that relationship and a profound experience of that relationship that can give rise to the deepest commitment that humanity has to actively care for and respect the ocean. And this is what James and indeed Dan alluded to, I think, of as the essence of a responsibility-based approach to law and governance as opposed to a rights-based approach. And digging into this responsibility-based approach, there are just a few things that I want to mention. It recognises the life-affirming aspects of reciprocity. And this concept of reciprocity is absolutely critical. But it also recognises, again, as Dan and James, and in fact Rachel alluded to, ancestral obligations between past, present and future generations. So a key question for us and for me as an international environmental lawyer and as a human being is whether Eurocentric law can be fundamentally changed around this concept of relationship or ocean kinship, as Sue introduced us to. And so can this change happen, and can we see it happening anywhere? Not easy questions to answer, and it kind of depends where we look. And here I just want to touch on emerging international environmental law for the oceans. And this is around some of the most recent drafts for a new treaty, which is essentially an implementing treaty to the Law of the Sea Convention. And this new treaty is, on the face of it, intended to address conservation, not specifically protection, but conservation of biodiversity for only one part of the ocean, and that is the high seas. So some of you will recognize the acronym BBNJ's, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. These are ongoing negotiations at the UN level. They have been happening at various sort of stages for 15 years. They were supposed to conclude the official negotiations just a few weeks ago in New York, but states failed to reach agreement. So they have agreed to have one more round of negotiations. So we really don't know yet what the final form of this new treaty will be. Nevertheless, I just want to make a few observations about it that I think might be helpful for us. So when we look at this new draft, what do we see in that new draft? Do we see anything that is helpful here in terms of responsibility-based approach? Do we see anything there that is helpful in terms of understanding these fundamental relationships and understanding what Dan has quite quite rightly referred to as the call from the ocean to stand up and to fight for her health and her well-being and her evolutionary rights. When we look at this treaty, which has gone through various drafts, thanks largely to the leadership of Pacific Island states, although not exclusively, they're absolutely supported by a whole range of people and organizations from all over the world who have been fighting for the recognition of the importance of Indigenous knowledge and the importance of the relationship of traditional communities with the ocean. However, with the work of all of these people, we do see in the draft continuing references to human stewardship. And we see references to the human stewardship of the oceans for the benefit of present and future generations. We see references to maintaining the integrity of ocean systems, and we see references to the preservation of the inherent value of biodiversity. However, in my view, none of this is sufficient. It is largely insufficient. And these references, we should not get very excited about, nor should we look a gift horse in the mouth. So from my perspective, I think these references are little more than a precious toehold for now. And they can only be made meaningful if at all levels, international, national, and of course the local, we begin to act as the ancestors that we would want to be. So what does that mean? Well, here I've just got a few ideas of how we can act now to be the ancestors that we would hope that future generations would look back upon with some degree of acknowledgement of our efforts. So here are some of the things that I think that we can be doing to make these basic references in a draft treaty meaningful into the future. First of all, we can advocate for and be actively involved in the establishment of large-scale no-take marine reserves, and to have marine reserves all around the world, enduring, no-take, and networked. We can participate in campaigns, again, all around the world for moratoriums on seabed mining. We can support legal rights for nature in circumstances where those rights call us into a renewed relationship with nature that requires commitment and responsibility. So here I'm again flagging some of the things that we've already touched on, that rights in themselves may not take, legal rights in themselves may not take us where we need to go. They have to be fundamentally embedded in a relationship of the strongest commitment and responsibility. We can also seek reforms at all levels centered on care and respect for the earth, but also acknowledging the principles of fairness and equity for all. So in essence, my point is simply this: the law won't change until we do. We have to embody that change. And we can do this. And there are many and varied ways in which we can do it, but we cannot look to the law in itself to change, and we cannot look to new language and law to really bring about the changes that we seek. So thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.
I'm mute again. Gosh, I'm having a great day. I was saying thank you very much, Prue. That was excellent. And we will, all of us will be having some discussion shortly, because there's a number of questions coming in and ways that we can connect some of these key ideas. So thank you very much. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce Elise Huffer. And Elise, do remind me where you are today. I can't remember where you're based.
I'm always based in the same place, which is Fiji. So Isambula Vinaka to everyone.
Lovely.
And thanks for the invitation, Michelle. Sorry about the glare in my glasses. So I just wanted to kind of build a bit on what James talked about in terms of sort of kinship rights and obligations, because I think that really needs to be a strong focus. And what I'm going to talk about is really some of the things that are happening at the Pacific Islands regional level, because that's where I'm based, that's where I work. I'm originally half French, half American, Fiji citizen, been in the region for about close to 30 years now, and had the privilege of working at the Pacific Community, SPC, as culture advisor for 10 years, which enabled me to work around the region. And I'm now back at where I was initially, which is the Oceania Center for Arts and Culture at the University of the South Pacific as an adjunct. So I just wanted to bring us back to something called the Maupiti Ocean Declaration, which was a declaration that was made by a range of countries at a meeting, a World Heritage, Pacific World Heritage meeting that was held at Maupiti in 2009. So there was Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, Cook Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, French Polynesia, Hawaii, Kiribati, Niue, New Caledonia, Palau, PNG, Rapa Nui, Samoa, Solomon Islands, and Tonga. And this declaration, which never became an official UNESCO document, was something that really came out strongly at the end of this meeting. If some of you are familiar with sort of World Heritage work at UNESCO, it's always quite formal. There's a lot of rules and procedures to follow. And at the end of this meeting, it all just exploded with this Ocean Declaration. And I just wanted to read a bit of what's in the Declaration. Because I think it really brings out that kinship and the relationship between Pacific peoples, humans, and the ocean. So this is what they said. We reaffirm that for many Pacific communities, there are sacred and intrinsic links with land, sky, and ocean. This constitutes for many a fundamental and spiritual basis of existence. The ocean is a holistic reality of the life cycles of the earth. The ocean is their identity, way of living, values, knowledge, and practices that have sustained them for millennia. We acknowledge that the ocean represents for many island communities the beginning and the end of their heritage, respected, shaped, and passed through successive generations by their ancestors. We observe that the ocean is a sacred, essential entity for many island communities, which is subject to a climate crisis of human origin. We observe that the loss of values associated with the ocean and its resources threatens the collective physical, moral, spiritual well-being, integrity, and survival of many island communities. We recognize the need to safeguard knowledge, spirituality, traditional practices, and their interrelationship with land, sky, and ocean. We urgently call to action all nations and peoples of the world to join and protect, manage, maintain, and sustain the cultural and natural integrity of the ocean for our ancestors and future generations. I just wanted to flag that because there's not many people who've heard about this Ocean Declaration, and it was way back in 2009. And so what I've been working on with colleagues, including colleagues at Pacific Community who are involved in the BBNJ negotiations, is really trying to bring that kinship relationship and that cultural relationship at policy level when it comes to ocean policy, because ocean policy in our region is very much sort of focused on resource use. So all the things that the ocean can bring. So there's a lot about, transport, fisheries, blue economy, all these sorts of things. And then there's the big focus on science because of the impacts of climate change. So even though Pacific Island leaders always reference culture and kinship relationships, when it actually comes to transforming that into policy and having an impact at policy level, it all just, it becomes empty. There's very little there, and policy-wise. So one of the areas where this really became obvious was when the Pacific Island countries in New York were beginning to negotiate BBNJ at the just a bit prior to the Intergovernmental Committee meeting level, which is where it's at now. It's on the 5th one. That's Prue was talking about, the 5th meeting that just took place in New York. So in 2016, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, which hosts the Office of the Pacific Ocean Commissioner, started reaching out to people working in culture and asking, hey, can you give us some data, something that we can work with to put up our case at the BBNJ negotiations, to include traditional knowledge, Indigenous holders of that knowledge as part of the negotiations, and therefore as part of the management of the high seas, part of the conservation and management of the high seas. So there were a couple of us trying to scramble around to find information that could be packaged in a way that makes sense at the policy level. So there's someone called Clement Yaumulalap. Some of you may know him, who's advisor to the president of the Federated States of Micronesia, who put together a really great paper to lay out why traditional knowledge of Pacific Islanders is legitimate, what's there, and why it should be part of the negotiations. So some of what Prue was talking about sort of began at that time, and since then has built up. But we still have an issue, which is that a lot of the information about those cultural relationships, for instance, with the whale migrations, connections with birds, all the creatures of the sea, of the ocean that move around over huge distances, the information about that is really quite difficult to find. It's very scattered. It's in a few manuscripts here and there. There's some work happening now, but the issue is not having that accessible and not in places where it's easy to find, documented, so that it can then be shifted into the policy area more easily. So one of the things that I've been working on is trying to bring that data, create a web platform somewhere, still under negotiation of where that is. We're trying to keep it in the region so that we can start bringing that data together, what's already been published, and then commission work by especially people in navigation who have a lot of knowledge. Of course, some of it, being traditional knowledge needs to be protected, and some can be published, some can't be published. But to make that more accessible so that we can start shifting things at a policy level. So when somebody who's in policy wants to make a case for, for instance, with the whales, why not have why not have cultural corridors for whales? Things like that, but you need data to make that case. And this really comes back to that kinship and obligation aspect of it. Is that if we can demonstrate that kinship through materials that show that relationship over time, that knowledge over time, it's easier then to make a case. Well, this needs to be protected. We have an obligation as a Pacific community to protect this because it's been with us for centuries. It has meaning for us, and then when you start negotiating between fisheries, between transport, between all these competing interests, then you can you have something to show. So I think I'll leave it at that, because I see there's things shifting on the screen here. But yeah, so that's really what those are the kinds of things that I'm working on, and that I think we need to really develop as a region. Okay.
No, that's wonderful, Elise. No, I was bringing everyone back because my first question is for you, Elise.
Oh,
Could you say the name again of the Ocean Declaration? A number of folks have said they hadn't heard of it, the 2009 one. What was it actually?
Okay, it's the Maupiti. So that's the island in Polynesia where it's where the meeting took place. So Maupiti is. I'll just write it down.
Yeah, if you could
I'll send
put
you
it
a
in the
link.
chat, that'd be great. Thank
I'll
you.
just throw it in here.
And Maupiti Ocean Declaration. So 2009. That's fantastic. Thank you, Elise. So we have a couple of questions that are kind of separate conceptually from each other. What I'd like to start with is a little statement trying to encapsulate some of what we've talked about, and then ask you guys for your opinions, if that's okay. So if someone has joined this call and they really don't know much about either the law of the sea or how things are regulated right now, would it be fair to say, in very simplistic terms, when we think about human beings' relationships with the oceans, and if we think about it in terms of scale, so that folks can understand the work that you're doing and why and how some of these ideas connect. So for thousands of years, since time immemorial, Aboriginal people in this country have had their own relationship with the patchwork of oceans around the land that is now Australia, and other places throughout the Pacific, throughout the world. Everyone's had their own relationships with their local marine, rivers, oceans, bays, etc. And depending on their culture and their language, how they've cared for that place, how they've interacted with it, has been completely unique and different to their neighbours, and so on. But what folks may not be aware is that the current international law really is the legal system that emerged after the Second World War, built by the victors of the Second World War on top of 500 years of European colonialism. So international law in our current world is considered to be that law between nation states, between Australia and New Zealand and the US. Little people, communities, aren't actually normally recognised as subjects of the law in international law. So what we're seeing is this rolling system through UNCLOS, the law of the sea, the big high-level treaties between nation states. And over the many decades I've been watching it, this endless debate between the top-down approach of governments just making a law, very focused on resource extraction, and this endless argument that Indigenous peoples and local peoples should be having a greater say over what's going on in international and regional law. Then at the same time, we're seeing this constantly reforming, renorming, strengthening of local laws. So my question to you all is, when we look at UNCLOS and we look at the BBNJ, which fit neatly into what I would call traditional environmental law, and then we see all of the work that the navigators and the wayfarers and others are doing to continue their customary, that's what Westerners call it, their local laws. How do we think this all fits together, and how could it fit together? And Rachel, I know you're new to your area of work, but a question that did come in privately is, how does the rights of oceans fit with current international law? And how does that fit with the current patchwork quilt of local traditional law? Is it just a giant big mess? Or are human beings making any kind of progress in thinking about regulating ourselves? Because it's not about regulating the ocean, it's about regulating ourselves and our relationship with the ocean. So I hope that that potted overview helps some people who don't understand the law. I know it's terribly, tragically simplistic, but be aware that when we talk about international law, it's very new compared to the ancient relationships people have. And I often have a big problem with it personally, because it's so exclusive of ordinary folks in the real world. And it's often focused on European values of using everything up. Does anyone feel like tackling my broadly weird question, comment, whatever it is, ramble? James is looking very thoughtful. Prue? How's it all fit together, love? What are we doing as humans with our oceans?
Well, we have this huge divide, you know, and the we have increasing tension, I think. And what I see actually is, so when I watch what's going on in terms of, the development of the international law and to some extent national law, you see a schizophrenia happening. It's just a terrible schizophrenia where people are beginning to really sense that they're not doing the right thing, but nevertheless they're trapped into repeating these very superficial rights-based exploitative approaches. So it's almost like sometimes I see this boiling tension as incredibly worrying. And sometimes I see it as actually potentially productive, that it will push us into something very different, and that tension is necessary. This mess that we're creating, which I think is a mess, has the potential to push us into something totally different. Sometimes actually I hear myself getting so frustrated with what's going on internationally that I've been calling on international lawyers and also government officials to just stop what they're doing. That actually we need an acknowledgement that a new BBNJ treaty could be worse than what we've got. Mm. Because it pretends to be something it's not, and it will lock us, for all the time and energy that we've put into it, it will lock us into something which, when you really look at the detail, can in fact be inferior to some aspects of the Law of the Sea Convention and to some aspects of other legal conventions. So it's almost like there's the potential for us to recognise that no more of this. We have to just stop doing this and start again from basic principles. And in terms of doing that, I'd just like to come back to something Dan mentioned, which is something I've done a lot of work on over the years. And that is this idea of the commons. And that the ocean itself is one of the great ecological commons, and it is something that we need to share, and we have been sharing, and that we in fact need to reorientate governance of ourselves around the sharing of the oceans and the flourishing of oceans and human communities around that idea of commons. And in fact, when you pick back through the development of international law, and particularly international law of the seas, actually the commons is there, and it was colonized by other concepts which treat parts of the ocean as ownable, as property, or exploitable without reference to the common good. So I actually think in my positive moments that if we could bring back into our awareness these ancient concepts of the commons and collectivity for the common good across generations, with Indigenous knowledge, with Indigenous traditions, but not in a passive way. We have to integrate these things. Then we have the potential. But we have to do it actively, right? It's not good talking about it and coming up with fancy legal principles and chucking them into treaties. We need to actively be doing that so we understand what that means in terms of how we have to change. And that's the thing. I mean, we all have to change, and we have to change now, So it's like we have to bring all of these things together, and that's huge.
It is huge. And that feeling of deep frustration and can we just stop for a moment and start again? That's what I get every time I see the mishmash of international efforts. And then what's very different with the folks on the ground doing the caring for sea country in Australia or other activities. But does anyone else have thoughts on this kind of jigsaw puzzle of different approaches, different scales, different cultural worldviews? Elise, you're smiling. Did you want to share something? Oh, you're on mute.
I'm smiling because I have a colleague here who's listening in, who's called Tekao, who's from Polynesia and who works on BBNJ. So I'm trying to get her to answer because she knows a lot more about this than certainly I do. But so that's my roundabout way of inviting Tekao. If you're willing to respond to that, because I think your perspective would be really interesting as you've been working on this for a long time.
Thank you, Elise. Hello, colleagues. Sorry, I'm not putting my camera. My bandwidth is not great today because it's overcast. So hello, everyone. So my name is Tekao, and I work at the Office of the Pacific Ocean Commissioner. And as Elise mentioned, I've been following BBNJ for some time now. And indeed, amongst the many priorities that the Pacific has, the recognition of the role and interests of Indigenous people and local communities as holders of traditional knowledge has been definitely one of the key elements that the Pacific has successfully promoted. So I note that, as Prue mentioned, that it might not be super great what we have currently in the zero draft, but do trust me that for lawyers, especially law of the sea lawyers, it's actually a very important step forward. So you've raised a very difficult question to answer in short time, but pretty much the law of the sea is not just something that was driven by the West or the global North. We did have some developing states and Pacific islands who actually played a significant role. And Fiji, for instance, was one of the key players in the law of the sea. Currently, this very imperfect convention is on a very fragile balance between different interests, and that's why we have different zones with different regimes, different rights, and different obligations for states. So it's pretty much, on the one hand, those who want to exploit, and on the other hand, the owners, quote unquote, of the resource. But of course, because it's international law, it comes from the main actors are the states, not the communities. And so having in the BBNJ discussions, which, as was mentioned, is going to be an implementing agreement on the Convention on the Law of the Sea, having in that future instrument the recognition of Indigenous people and local communities as actors to be taken, to be considered and included in designs of measures, but also in decision making, is a significant steps. Maybe I'm biased and maybe I've been in this way too much, but I do believe that the law of the sea is currently drafted, as well as the way BBNJ could end up looking, depending on whether or not we continue on that road, can definitely support the recognition of ocean kinship. I say this because in the law of the sea, it's not just about rights, it's also about obligations. And if we include in the BBNJ instrument something which is already hinted at in the UNCLOS, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, if we hint at stewardship and this idea of moral duty that we have to protect and preserve the ocean, then we have to implement decisions that would aim at maintaining the integrity of the oceans. That's where I see what we have currently and what we potentially can have as supportive of that recognition of ocean rights and ocean kingships.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Takao. That's lovely.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
It's very complex, we know. Okay, so that was my big question that linked a few of the scale things together. A quick question for you, Rachel, which is both stemming from James's question. When you were giving your talk, he wrote, it's an interesting point, Rachel. Could you speak more about lessons learned from the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth? And also, if you're able, can you comment on how the work that's being done to promote universal recognition of ocean rights fits with the existing international laws, given what we've just talked about? Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, absolutely. We're still exploring and researching other global frameworks or processes and strategies that have been successful or not in the past, such as even the resolution to develop a global treaty for plastic that was unanimously agreed upon. But there's still more we can learn from the process as well in regards to the Rights of Mother Earth Declaration. But we recognize that in presenting a full draft, this would not likely ensure a truly inclusive and consultative process. So that's why we seek to ensure that we do consult with others across the globe, that we learn and we receive this feedback, and that we're inclusive in this sense. And when we're just asked, presenting a vision, representing understandings and values of the ocean in a plurality of ways, then in the future, the UNGA could develop this process, and in doing so, ensure that delegates, all stakeholders across the board are equitably involved. And then to the second question, the vision of a declaration is to be norms of values, understandings, worldviews of our relationship with the ocean in an interdependent and reciprocal way. So each country may develop laws and responses in their own context, but globally have this like revolved and renewed framework and of values and norms of the ocean, and recognizing our responsibility towards nature, towards living in harmony with the ocean. And also recognizing the ocean is, of course, interconnected to all Earth, all ecosystems, but because it's so siloed within international frameworks to date, I think the ocean deserves particular respect and attention in this sense.
Thank you, Rachel. Very helpful. We're just about out of time. There is a final question from Michelle about how do we address pollution, plastic pollution and ocean acidification. I wonder if we could, Prue's smiling at that huge question as well, but perhaps we could all just make some final comments on how can we, as individuals and parts of collectives, take responsibility for our relationship with the ocean, both day to day or, in terms of tools and instruments to support. Would you all like to just make a couple of very quick comments and then we might wrap up? Dan, perhaps we could start with you because I haven't picked on you yet.
Yeah, sure. We have a word in New Zealand called tikanga, and it broadly means doing things a Māori way. And tikanga operated both as a system of law, but also as a system of personal responsibility. So I think for trying to address those issues that were raised by Michelle, it's as much as setting laws and policies and regulations that will minimise the use of those things so they can't get into the ocean in the first place, as much as it is in our everyday lives and everyday decisions we make, recognising the power that sits within us. And the beauty of tikanga is that you do it because it's the right thing to do. And tikanga is often understood as doing the right thing. So I think that's what I'll offer. And maybe one other final one, I'll be cheeky, is that I'm agreeing that I think we've got a lot to learn from Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing, and just remind us that we're all Indigenous to this planet.
It's not cheeky at all, Dan. It's very good. It's also very inclusive when we remember we are all born of the same stardust as coral and fish and asparagus. You know, we're all here. Thank you, Dan. Any other thoughts you'd like to share, folks? I don't want to force you all to say something profound and important as we wrap up, but if you did want to share any thoughts on our own personal responsibilities, I think Dan captured many of the ideas beautifully. James is nodding. I think he's just saying what Dan said.
Yeah, totally nodding in support of Dan.
Good one.
Yeah, I'll just add that as you know, a lot of us are involved in outrigger paddling and other ocean-based you know, sports or activities. So the ocean is part of our daily life. So there's definitely a lot of plastic pickup. I used to get on the case of my teammates when we'd be waiting to get the canoe down, and there was all this plastic lying on the at USP at the foreshore, because unfortunately we get the currents that come down from one of the rivers where there's a dump. So we with the trade winds, we get everything on our beach. And I've seen that now there's a whole group at USP that collects plastic on a regular basis, measures it, and all of that information goes to government. But obviously it's a much bigger question. I think there's an international treaty on plastic pollution being negotiated at present, with all its probable flaws, Prue, that you will no doubt pick up. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's really about having activities on all levels, you know, what you can do locally and what can be done internationally, regionally, nationally, etc.
Thank you.
Okay,
Elise.
thank you so much.
No, thank you. And Prue, final word?
Well, probably not a final word, certainly final word from me. But I would also say have courage to, you know, really engage in what some people would have us think are issues that are really just for the experts. You know, so one of the things that really grates with me is ocean acidification. You know, it's sort of like it's kind of swept under the carpet, and you know, it's sort of a fundamental problem. And then when you sit down and think about it, you have to query the experts, like, well, you know, all this attention on climate change, and really, you know, it's really a problem that we're not also dealing with ocean acidification as a related but a problem of its own. So I would sort of say, you know, don't be afraid, get in there and really ask questions of experts. Don't be put off by expert explanations of things. Like, get in and ask the big questions. And I think often, you know, when we come at these issues fresh, we are able to see the issues much more clearly than, you know, the experts can. So get in there.
I think that's terrific. And I think in a way, that's what our humble network is all about. Just ordinary folks doing amazing work and connecting in. And I have put twice into the chat, if anyone's interested in knowing a little bit more about what the Ocean Rights and Kinship Network is up to, and often it is about sharing information. But as we saw today, when Elise was sharing info about the 2009 declaration, sharing info can be an incredibly powerful role, and cutting across different scales of work and inspiring each other to keep going. These are all the good values of a good network, I think. But look, on that note, I literally have to jump off now into another call. Before I say goodbye, in case anyone's interested, our next webinar is actually about nature positive design with a rather remarkable person called Delwyn Jones from the EVA Institute. I've just put the Zoom link in. If anyone feels like jumping into that with us, we'll be kicking that off at about 2 minutes past 12:30. Or 12:32 to normal human beings. But I would like to say a huge thank you to our wonderful folks as part of the Ocean Rights and Kinship Network have joined us to share what they're up to. Everyone's very busy, very important work. And thank you all in the audience for being part of these initial discussions. And I think we should change ourselves to the Ocean Rights and Kinship Alliance, because then we can call ourselves ORCA. It'll be ORKA. I'm getting lots of claps. Yeah, bugger it. There's a particular meaning to network versus alliance, but I think we go with alliance so we can be orca. But yeah, we'd love to stay in touch, and our AILA network will be kept up to date. And there is going to be a web page. It's already there on the website. James and I are going to put a bit of info there. So go orca. Yeah, thank you, Tinaka. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And as I often say when we have an international audience, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Thank you for joining us from the evening of yesterday, Rachel, and from various times today. Time zones freak me out, but it's all good. Thank you so much, everybody. You take care, and we might see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.